On one chilly winter afternoon in the early 1900s, Boston's North End was decimated by a terrible flood. But this mahogany wave was not water, but a sticky, syrup-like sugar called molasses. The aftermath of the Great Molasses Flood of 1919 is an example of a historical event where Boston's wronged citizens utilized the rights granted by their country to achieve justice, and the liable United States Industrial Alcohol Company was held accountable for their responsibility to pay for their gross mistake. In the early 1900s, molasses was a highly profitable industry, although not in its original form. When fermented, though, it could be converted into a substance known as industrial alcohol, which was used at the time in the manufacturing of munitions and weapons for World War I. One supplier of these factories was United States Industrial Alcohol. After the war's conclusion, however, they focused on producing grain alcohol, a product in high demand due to the 18th Amendment Prohibition nearing its passage. United States Industrial Alcohol needed a place to store the grain alcohol when it was offloaded from one train and waiting until the next came to ship to a factory. And so came the idea of a gargantuan tank, over 50 feet high and 90 feet in diameter. However, the tank was built shoddily and leaked and groaned constantly, with workers and citizens in the surrounding areas sending warnings to United States Industrial Alcohol and their subsidiary operating the tank, Purity Distilling, to fix it to no avail. One worker in the surrounding area named Philip Lydon stated, "We could feel it. The vibration, bulging in and out. There was always a big leak too, near the junction of the second and third plates. Molasses ran down the side of the tank, enough for the children in the neighborhood to be there every day to get a dose of it. They would be here from early morning till late at night." United States Industrial Alcohol went as far as to hire painters to coat the tank in a dark brown that made it harder to see the oozing molasses, just to avoid making the necessary repairs. Still, the tank stood for nearly 4 years after its construction, until an unfortunate chain of events led to one of the most infamous disasters in Boston history. On January 13th, 1919, a large shipment of molasses from Puerto Rico was pumped into the tank, this delivery marking only the tank's fourth time in its history of being fully filled. This additional weight and temperature change put too much stress on the rivets of the tank and its thin steel walls that measured at most 0.67 inches in thickness, a width that was not even half the amount needed to properly support its contents. This, coupled with the fact that too little manganese, a substance used to strengthen metals, had been mixed with the steel, gave it a brittle and breakable shell. And so the tank's breaking point was reached 2 days later at approximately 12:30 p.m., when the tank would be described as cracking open like an egg, with several witnesses stating that the rivets blew off in rounds like gunfire as the steel walls folded outward. What followed was a massive swell of molasses that was up to 40 feet tall and 160 feet wide, the same width as a football field, moving at a speed of nearly 35 miles per hour. The wave encompassed several city blocks, tearing up dozens of buildings and homes, along with a fire station. The destruction totaled up to a monetary loss of near $100 million in today's money. The flood also swept up approximately 25 horses and 175 people, injuring 150 of them and killing the other 21. Local search and rescue teams soon started looking for any survivors they could pull out of the wreckage, wading through places coated with nearly a foot of the sticky brown liquid. As the Boston Post stated, "The sight that greeted the first of the rescuers on the scene is almost indescribable in words. Molasses, waist deep, covered the street and swirled and bubbled about the wreckage. Here and there struggled a form. Whether it was animal or human being was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass, showed where any life was. Horses died like so many flies on sticky flypaper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared. Human beings, men and women, suffered likewise." And it was only 5 days after the initial explosion that welders first started to cut through the remnants of the tank to look for trapped survivors. Soon after the tragic event, a trial was held where several cases were brought to the Superior Court, with a total of 119 lawsuits being brought against United States Industrial Alcohol. The cases combined into one class action lawsuit, a relatively new idea at the time, that lasted for 6 years and would become known as Dudley H. Dorr, Trustee et al. Versus United States Industrial Alcohol Company. Both sides of the class action suit fought with a strong conviction, with Boston citizens claiming its failure was a result of poor construction, and United States Industrial Alcohol stating that its failure was because of a bomb planted by immigrant anarchists. United States Industrial Alcohol's claims were believable as several occurrences of immigrant-led anarchy had spread across the United States at the time, with widespread incidents such as the infamous Red Scare. At a time when immigrants were already disliked as they were believed to have stolen jobs from native-born Americans, the fear of attacks caused even stronger and more widespread xenophobia. This claim was advocated for in the courtroom with the evidence that Boston's North End had a high population of immigrants, including a very dense demographic of Italian Americans, a group known to have produced several anarchists. In the courtroom, United States Industrial Alcohol paid upwards of $50,000 in expert witness fees to reinforce their claims. However, the position of Boston citizens was aided by the strong testimony of nearly 920 witnesses who attested to the claims of blatant neglect to the tank by the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. Eventually, even with United States Industrial Alcohol's highly trained lawyers and endless resources, the auditor of the trial, Colonel Hugh W. Ogden of the Massachusetts Superior Court, came to the conclusion that the tank had burst due to its factor of safety being too low, and that the tank had received insufficient maintenance upon an already fragile structure. United States Industrial Alcohol was then forced to pay nearly $628,000 in restitution to the relatives of the victims of the tank's collapse, with families of the deceased receiving upwards of $7,000, a sum near $100,000 in value today. One such victim was a 10-year-old boy named Pasquale Lantosa, who was scavenging near the tank for firewood to cook his lunch when the tank exploded, and it was several days until his body was identified underneath a piece of the ruined tank, finally allowing his father Giuseppe to grieve. Another victim of the explosion was the 65-year-old Bridget Clougherty, whose home was destroyed in the vacuum effect of the tank's explosion, with her roof collapsing on top of her. One of her sons, Martin Clougherty, who was in the house at the time of the explosion, stated to the Boston Globe, "It seemed as if the house had split in two when it hit the elevated structure, and I was in one side and my people in the other," he told the Globe. "I couldn't find my mother. I shouted for her and yelled for those who had come along the street to find her, but I couldn't locate her. It seemed an hour while I was trying to find her, but soon someone told me that she had been found and that she was dead." These citizens used their rights to fight for justice in the courtroom to help compensate them for damages and losing their homes and other assets, including the tragic loss of their loved ones, and in doing so, proved a powerful point that no matter the power a person or organization held, they were still responsible for their failures, and those affected by those failures had a right to demand compensation. Though the flood was a tragic incident in its great loss of life and livelihoods, it ushered in a new era of accountability. To start, Boston's building department later passed legislation requiring all engineers and architects working on construction plans to include their signature in all of their calculations, to hold the designers of construction projects liable to their work's possible failure. This legislation soon spread across every state in America to hold the designers of construction projects liable to their work's possible failure. Later, stringent laws were also passed nationwide requiring all engineers to obtain proper certifications, which, as it was uncovered, Arthur P. Gell, the lead engineer of the tank, had never received. This is more than likely a contributing factor to the tank's demise. Stricter construction codes were also passed to further secure the safety of new building projects, along with having more extensive processes put in place for architects and engineers to obtain a building permit to make certain their calculations and designs were correct. These laws still exist today and protect us by regulating creation of infrastructure that exists in our lives to a high degree of safety. Without such safeguards put in place, far more structures would be created ineffectively, possibly leading to a great loss of human life. In summary, the Great Molasses Flood pioneered a new age of liability in construction. This ensures that those who improperly erected and horridly maintained infrastructure that negatively impacted livelihoods would be forced to exercise their responsibility to compensate those who possess the right to demand payment for their losses. To this day, residents of Boston swear that in the sweltering summer heat, passers-by walking on sidewalks can still smell the molasses wafting up from the cracks, a constant reminder of the senseless loss of 1919.